thank you guys. Thank you for the introduction. I'm a software engineer at Microsoft. I work mostly on building React apps. And so the stack that my team uses is fully open source, and I get to work really closely with a lot of designers on our team. And something that I feel like doesn't really get a whole lot of attention at meetups and at conferences is how to build with your users in mind, like building for your users, not just because like, oh, this looks pretty, I'm gonna do this. And so today we're gonna talk about A/B testing, and specifically how we can harness the power of A/B testing to build data-driven UI, and kind of bring a little bit more objective answers to this very subjective field. So to start out with, we're gonna talk a little bit about what A/B testing is, kind of how the whole experimentation process looks like, and then we're going to dive into some code examples of what implementing this in your React app would actually look like. So first of all, what's A/B testing? It's basically a fancy name for an experiment. It's a way to compare two or more versions of something to decide which one will perform better. And it's actually been around for a really long time. Farmers used to perform A/B testing to decide which fertilizers would work best with which crops. So if it's good enough for farmers back in the day, it's good enough in 2019, right? Why do we even need to waste all this engineering time on A/B testing? Like, why not just pick what our UI is gonna look like and just ship it and not even bother running experiments, right? So imagine this. You're working on this awesome app, and you're almost done, you're super excited to ship, and you're demoing it, and someone speaks up and they're like, oh, why don't we make this button blue instead of green? I think it's gonna look better. So how do you argue with someone when their argument is like, well, I think it looks nice, like maybe you think another color looks nice. So instead of like relying on these very subjective and like emotional feelings towards your product, and like your product is your baby, and you care about it, and you want others to love it, but design is design and it needs to work for your users. If your users can't use your product, then you didn't really succeed. And so in order to answer this question, we can use A/B testing. So the way that we do this is we run experiments on the front end. And the nice thing about it is we don't have to keep redeploying our client-side code. With this experimentation, our app will dynamically choose 50% of users to view the control, 50% of users to view variant 1. Imagine that we have like 2 different colors in this scenario. At a very high level, when a user sees a variant and they interact with it, we see, oh, that was a successful UI. Like our users were able to interact with it and they completed the action that we wanted them to, and so we count that as a win. And so in order to decide which one performs better, you see which one gets more interaction. And this works with however many number of variants you have. Of course, like you don't want to test like 20 different colors for the same piece of UI, but usually choosing between like 2 to 5 different things is pretty good to test. Why even experiment? We kind of covered a little bit about this before, but there's like design guidelines and like proven ways to organize your UI at like a very high level, but there's not really answers for like what color should we use in this scenario, or like what specific shopping cart icon should we use. And so this is where A/B testing can be really powerful. By performing these experiments on users directly instead of like a small internal group of users, we can see how like with whatever variant we end up picking, we'll be able to tell exactly how customers will react to it because we've already tested it. It's not going to be a guessing game when we actually ship this feature. So kind of throwing back to like grade school, how do we actually experiment? We can't just be like, oh, we're going to experiment every part of our UI and it's going to be great. We're going to have 5 billion experiments in our product because then you'll never ship. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is research the current behaviors behavior of your users on your app or product. So the goal of this is to understand what's going wrong. It's great if other things are going right, but that doesn't fix problems. So we're going to want to analyze what's going wrong. Where is our user engagement dropping off? You want to have like very specific things in mind of features that aren't working, or maybe a certain area of your product is getting a lot of traffic but not a lot of conversions or not a lot of sales, things like that. Then we can identify the root cause of the problem. Is a user not signing up for your service because maybe the sign-up form is too long, it has too many fields, bombarding them all at one time? Maybe they can't tell where the shopping icon is or the checkout icon is, right? And so once we've kind of identified why this is happening, we can create our hypothesis. So in like the example that we were talking about before, our hypothesis will be like a green button will lead to more clicks, which will lead to maybe more sales in this case. Once we've figured out our hypothesis, we can actually start experimenting. Step 4. Based on your hypothesis, you're going to create your control value, which is probably going to be whatever you're currently shipping in your product today, and then a few different variants that are like educated guesses. So like we talked about before, we don't want to have like 100 billion variants, but like a very small subset of things that some people feel very strongly that might work. And we're going to want to make sure that you run the experiment up until you have a statistically significant value. So you're not just going to like run it for a week and be like, oh, the green button got clicked on 5 times and the blue one only got clicked on twice. Like clearly green is the winner, because that's a difference of 3 is not very good. So once you've run it until you have a statistically significant value, and I'll talk about some tools for how to figure that out, you can actually sit down and analyze your data. You can see which of the variants, or maybe the control, was the best option, and that's totally fine. And now you have data to back up why your design is the way it is. And once you've picked it, you can remove all of the experimentation code that you spent a long time writing, but you'll be very happy because all of your users will be able to actually use your product, and then you can ship it. So some quick tips, because like for me, coming from a developer and like a designer background, like I have no knowledge on statistics or data science or any of that. So like we talked about before, your results need to be statistically significant, and so usually we're aiming for 95 to 99% significance. In order to do that, you can't just run your experiment on like 2 people. You need to have like a pretty substantial sample size, and so usually we say like 1,000 users is a pretty good size to have. And there are calculators that I'll show you later, like maybe you need to scale up or scale down from that number. You're going to want to make sure that you find something of value to test. Like if you already have 99% of users engaging with a specific part of your UI, maybe 1% isn't going to make a huge difference if there's another piece of UI that like only half of your users are finding. So you're going to want to really like hone in on things that are going to bring you like the biggest ROI. Finally, like test something's significantly different. Users probably aren't going to notice if there's a comma or not a comma in a certain tiny piece of text that's like hidden somewhere, right? You usually want to test buttons, images, calls to action, things that users will either interact with or things that are trying to drive users to interact with something. Test small components. You don't want to just like create an entirely new design for your website and then test that whole thing. You're going to have a billion uncontrolled variables. Make sure that you're testing small pieces. You can run multiple experiments on multiple different parts of your website or your app, but don't just like completely change the design and try to test all of that all together. And then finally, test in parallel. You want to make sure that you're testing your control alongside all of your variants to make sure that your user base is the same across the board. And that just reduces like the number of uncontrolled variables that you have. And it helps you make sure that like if you're going to run variant 1 on week 1 and variant 2 on week 2, like maybe user traffic was really low on week 1 and you're just not giving all of your variants a fair shot. So there's a couple resources that I'll kind of just quickly skip through. There's this tool, and like you guys will have access to the slides later, and you can just like look at the links. This will tell you if your results are statistically significant without you having to do math, because that's not fun. There's this tool which will tell you kind of a little bit of a better estimate of what sample size you need. And then this tool will tell you approximation of how many days you're going to have to run your experiment for. This takes into account like hitting your statistical significant values. You still need to hit that, but this is kind of useful for like making sure that you're time boxing your experiment, and it will kind of make it easier to gauge for like sprint planning and things like that. So now that we kind of have this like super high overview, let's see what this looks like in a React app. So you can use this in an existing React app, but this is just like, imagine we are creating a brand new one from scratch. So create React app, super easy. Next, we're going to want to use this package called React A/B Test. I'm pulling from the Marvel app fork because that's what supports React 16 and above. You can just pull from like the main package published by Pushtel if you're using something below React 16, which is sad. So you can see this is like a very basic React component. We have like a header, a block of text, and then a call to action button. And so our A/B test is going to determine, or help us determine, what's the best styling for our call to action text. I love dogs. So this is what it looks like when it's rendered. It's very pretty. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is great. We just import a whole bunch of things from our A/B test package. And I'll kind of go into detail on what each one of those does. So the first thing that we do, like any good developer, is we enable debugging, because we're never going to get this right on the first try. So we enable debugging, and now this is where we actually define our experiment. So we have our experiment name, and then we have an array of what we're going to name each of our variants. And this can be like however many variables you want. So for here, we're going to have our control, which was the black button that we saw, and then a blue button, a green button, and then we have specified the different values that we want for like our probability. So in this case, we're just going to make it evenly spread across the board, so 33% chance that a user will hit one of those variants. Now, before we just had this button right here. So now what we're doing is we're going to wrap everything in an experiment. And so we just say, hey, this is the experiment for the name that matched this guy up here. And then we can start listing off all of our variants. So the first one is our control. It's just the same button that we had before, nothing fancy happening. And then we start adding more variants. So this is the blue variant, and we just copy and paste the same code for the button we had before. And in here, we're just experimenting on the color, so we're just like giving it another class. But you could experiment on things like the text in the button, like any other piece of UI. Like maybe we want like a bunch of emojis and like things circling the button. I don't know, you can do whatever you want. And then we just have our third variant. We have the green button. So this is what it looks like live. So this is the debugger panel that we were talking about before. So this just helps us to not have to rely on, a 33% chance of hitting the variant that we're trying to test and making sure that our UI looks nice. This lets us just quickly flip between the different variants in our experiment, make sure that everything's working well. And something else that's important is we want to keep the user experience the same across the board once the user has entered into our experiment. So we don't want them to like land on our page, see a blue button, and then come back a day later, and now the UI is completely different, they get confused, and that could impact the result of your experiment. So the way this package handles this is it stores which variant you're seeing of your experiment in local storage. So if a user has seen this, this experiment before, it'll just pull the value that it's trying to show the user from local store. Otherwise, it will bucket it into one of the 3 variants that we had, and it will update local store. So now we have things working locally, but we don't actually know if a user is interacting with our UI yet. So this is where emitting wins comes in, and this is kind of what I touched on a bit before, determining what is the win condition for your experiment. In our case, we're experimenting on this button. And so a win for us is if the user clicks the button, right? Because that means that we're continuing on to like the next part of the UI. So the buttons that we had in our variants before, we're just hooking them up to this click handler. And all it does is it emits a win. And so all this is saying is, hey, for this experiment, we entered our win condition. Then here we have a win listener, and all it's going to do right now is just log. This is the variant name for the experiment that we're using. It's great, the user interacted with the button, problem solved. But we also maybe want to keep track of a user is seeing part of our experiment, but they're not interacting with it. We might want to capture data around that. So this package has a nice add play listener. Play listener just means like, hey, the experiment was loaded for the user. They haven't necessarily interacted with it, but they're seeing this variant. So this is all great, but it's still console log. And so now we're going to work on making it actionable. There's a bunch of different like data and telemetry capturing NPM packages. I'm just going to quickly walk through what it would look like with Mixpanel, just because it's easy. But this can work with like any tool that you want. This could be just an API call that you send to your own services. So when you get into Mixpanel, you create an app, you get your token, and then you just import your package. And then you just give it your app token. Super easy to set up, 2 lines of code. And then from here, instead of console logging, you can just switch to say mixpanel.track and pass it any object. And so from here, you can say this was our experiment name. Maybe we want to capture some PII or some timestamp or user ID, anything like that. We can just send it along to our backend. And from there, this is kind of what our graphs would look like, right? You can see like huge spike on December 18th. And you can kind of drill into that and see that, you know, it looks like our green variant is doing very well. We still have to wait until we have statistically significant data, but this is kind of how you would track and see kind of the live progress of how users are interacting with your experiment. And then from there, once you hit the values that you need to hit in order to stop your experiment, it's very easy to see who won and just go back through your code and rip out all of the experiment code. And it's really sad because you wrote it and it's your baby. But now your users will be very happy with your UI. And I can answer any questions that you guys have. Otherwise, we'll hand it over to Tyler. Yeah, so that's a good question. He was asking if I've ever used this for red block testing to like purposefully to test like buggy code. I haven't done anything like that before, but this could definitely be something that you could use even with like server-side rendering to decide which UI you're going to hand off to the user.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
How are you guys using it today? Or are you using it today?
So the product that I work on right now isn't even launched yet, and so we're still doing like A/B testing, like user testing with actual like mock-ups and stuff like that. So we don't even have any of this set up, but I've done experimentation stuff before on other teams that weren't using React, and the tooling was very painful to use. And this is just such a different experience. It's very easy. All the way back.
So you were saying that we shouldn't have more than like 2 to 5 variants. Is there a recommendation as to how many of those items that we should be testing at once?
As in like different
Yes,
experiments, different pieces of UI entirely. I don't know that there is a recommended value for that. I would just say as long as the pieces are very independent of each other, like you might not want to run an experiment. So let's say you have page A and page B. You might not want to run an experiment on A and B if like A needs to B, because there might be like some bias in there. But I think as long as the experiments are very independent of each other, there shouldn't be like a limiting number to that. Good question. Yeah, so the way that this package handles it is just doing the local store stuff. Now you could imagine a scenario where maybe you have a desktop user and a mobile user and you want a consistent experience for that user if they're logged in across all platforms. And there might be more robust packages that you can use to sort of accomplish that by like, having the user ID or something that kind of gets passed along. And that might have to be more like server-side logic. But at the end of the day, like, it's really just a mechanism to figure out like what piece of UI you're gonna render. So that might also be something that's solved through server-side rendering. Yes?
Is there a point where you want to ship a whole different app? So you have an A and a B and they're completely different applications? Is there a time where that makes sense?
So, yes, that's kind of what my team is going through right now. But I don't think necessarily that A/B testing is the right solution for that. So maybe like a broader experimentation where users use, like where you have like user testing and they go through a scenario A in the first app and the same scenario in the second app. At more like a high level, but A/B testing I feel like is more for very specific details of your design, not necessarily like a user experience standpoint.